At her billionaire ex-husband's wedding, she caught him smiling at the ring-bearer, not knowing. The moment that didn't belong to her. Celine Arden had never imagined she would one day stand on the manicured lawn of her billionaire ex-husband's wedding. It wasn't the sort of place a woman with her history, her scars or her pride should willingly walk into. And yet, on this sunlit afternoon, she found herself surrounded by wealth, so polished, it almost reflected her insecurities back at her. The lakeshore estate stretched before her like a painting trimmed in gold. Hydrangeas of impossible perfection framed stone walkways. Marble statues glimmered under soft beams of sunlight. Glass sculptures caught light and fractured it into small rainbows on the grass. Everything was beautiful in that carefully curated way only money made possible. Celine adjusted the soft beige shawl wrapped around her shoulders. It was a small shield, not against the coolness of the breeze, but against the cold reality of where she stood. She used to live in a world like this, still quiet, impeccably designed, but never once had she felt like she belonged in it. Even now, surrounded by the wealthy and the glamorous, she felt like a visitor in someone else's story. But none of that beauty, manufactured or natural, held her attention for long. Her gaze had drifted to him. Corin Hale. He stood beside her, tall and grounded, like the only real thing in a world made of glass. There was something about Corin that steadied her. The warmth in his eyes, the quiet strength in his posture, the kind of handsome that didn't ask to be noticed, but carried an ease that invited the heart to rest. She didn't know why he had insisted on accompanying her, but she knew she hadn't argued long. Earlier that morning, she had warned him gently. "You don't have to do this." "I know," he had replied, the softness in his voice almost disguised by the shrug of his shoulders. "But you also don't have to go alone." Now, as guests arranged themselves with practiced grace and murmured in hushed, excited voices, Celine kept her hands clasped together, resisting the instinct to reach for him. Corin's presence meant safety, comfort, something unnamed that settled in her chest like a bird taking shelter. But to touch him, that felt like crossing a boundary she wasn't ready to examine. The wedding march began, all movement quieted, all voices stilled, all heads turned. Dorian Crest, her ex-husband, the man who had once promised her forever and delivered a lonely echo instead, walked toward the altar with the confidence he'd been born into. His suit was tailored so precisely it looked like it had been sculpted on him. His smile was practiced, almost perfected by years of public appearances and polished image management. He took his place at the altar where his bride waited, radiant in pearl lace, glowing with the kind of hope Celine wished she had once felt. Celine's eyes remained forward. Her heart, though steady, felt oddly hollow. She had made peace with this moment in theory. In reality, peace was something she was still learning to inhabit. Then it happened. A child stepped onto the aisle. He was small, no more than 5 years old, with hazel eyes that shone like sunlight through amber glass. Soft curls framed his young face, giving him an angelic, almost ethereal quality. In his tiny hands, he carried a velvet cushion crowned with 2 diamond rings. Celine watched him for a moment with mild interest, the way one might watch any child participating in a ceremony meant for adults. But then she saw Corin. She saw his expression shift with a quiet, startling tenderness. He wasn't smiling at the bride. He wasn't smiling at the groom. He was smiling at the child. It was a small smile, gentle as a memory, warm in a way that felt deeply personal. It wasn't the smile of a man amused or entertained. It was the smile of someone who recognized something, or someone, beloved. Celine blinked, her breath catching slightly. Corin didn't often wear expressions he couldn't explain. He was straightforward, sincere, honest to a fault. His emotions, when they surfaced, were always unhidden, unpolished, unpretending. And that smile, that moment, didn't feel like it belonged in a place like this. The boy made his way down the aisle, unaware of the weight he had stirred in the man beside her. Corin's eyes followed him with a softness that unsettled Celine, not out of jealousy, but out of something deeper, quieter. Curiosity, concern. A question she didn't know how to form. Finally, she found her voice in a whisper barely louder than the rustling leaves. "You're awfully happy for someone watching his friend's ex-husband get remarried." Corin startled, his breath catching as if he'd been pulled abruptly out of a memory. "Oh, no, he reminds me of someone. Just that single word carried the weight of a story Celine knew she had never heard. A story tucked somewhere behind Corin's steady smiles and kind eyes. The ring-bearer continued down the aisle, and Corin's gaze lingered on him until the last possible second, until the boy disappeared from sight and the crowd shifted slightly, blocking the view. Celine didn't press him. She didn't ask who the child reminded him of. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Not yet. She stood in silence, trying to steady the strange flutter in her chest. Because today, of all days, she had expected to feel the faint sting of old wounds, perhaps a whisper of regret or an echo of heartbreak. But instead she felt something else. Something unexpected. A pull toward understanding the man beside her, a curiosity that opened like a small door in her heart. And on a day she thought belonged only to her past pain, she found herself facing a mystery she could not ignore, the mystery in Corin Hale's quiet smile. A smile he hadn't meant for her to see, a smile filled with the tenderness that didn't belong to this wedding, and perhaps didn't belong to her ex-husband's world at all. Celine used to believe that love could be built on beautiful things. She believed in grand gestures, in impressive surprises, in the kind of romance that sparkled like champagne in crystal glasses. She believed that a man who could give her the world must surely be a man who would hold her heart gently. She had believed all of this, because Dorian Crest had made it so easy to believe. When she first met him, she was swept into his orbit like a leaf caught in a well-dressed hurricane. Dorian had a presence that turned heads before he even spoke. People admired him, envied him, wanted to be him. His life was a gallery of success, billionaire investor, polished philanthropist, walking embodiment of a man who seemed to have conquered fate itself. And when he noticed her, quiet, unsure, still growing into herself, it felt like standing under the unexpected heat of the sun. Everything began fast. He invited her to dinners, where the silverware cost more than her monthly rent. He sent bouquets so large they barely fit through her apartment door. He swept her away on weekends to cities she had only seen in movies. Monaco, Copenhagen, Santorini, places where the water glimmered like polished gems and the air felt softer than her own world ever allowed. Celine, young and hopeful, had mistaken the extravagance for affection. She thought a man who moved mountains must surely be a man who loved deeply. She didn't yet understand that mountains can be moved with money, but hearts can only be moved with presence. The first months were dazzling enough to feel like a dream stitched together by diamonds, But even the most brilliant light cast shadows, and Celine began noticing them long before she had the courage to admit they mattered. Dorian wasn't unkind. He wasn't cruel. He simply wasn't there. Not in the ways that mattered. Their home was a mansion filled with expensive silence. Nights were spent waiting for him to return from meetings he insisted were unavoidable, waiting for conversations that ended before they began, waiting for a touch, a look, a moment that didn't feel rehearsed. Sometimes she would reach out across their vast bed, seeking warmth, only to find cold sheets and emptiness. He'd return late with the faint smell of cologne and ambition. He'd kiss her forehead absently, as if she were a cherished trophy rather than a partner. "You should be grateful," he'd say when she hinted at loneliness. Most women would kill for this life. Celine wondered if those women would have traded laughter for luxury, if they would have traded being seen for being displayed, if they would have traded companionship for the illusion of perfection. She didn't want to be ungrateful. She didn't want to be difficult. So she tried harder, tried dressing the way he liked, speaking the way society expected, smiling at events where her own name felt foreign in her mouth. She tried to mold herself into someone who fit into his life, the way a delicate vase fits perfectly into the corner of an immaculate room, beautiful, untouched, unused. But the truth was simple, painful, undeniable. You cannot bloom in a place that doesn't offer sunlight. And Celine had been living in the shade of a man who did not notice she was withering. Their marriage didn't end with explosions or shattering betrayals. It ended quietly, almost politely, a conversation over breakfast, a mutual agreement that felt more like a business negotiation than the dismantling of a life together. In the end, they didn't fight. There was no anger, no tears from him, no begging from her, just signatures, ink on paper, and the soft click of a door closing. The world whispered that Celine must be devastated to lose a billionaire husband, to lose the lifestyle, the status, the financial safety. But Celine had never mourned the luxury. She had mourned herself. She had mourned the version of her that had tried to become someone unrecognizable in order to be loved. She mourned the quiet moments she had given away, the dreams she had shelved, the laughter she had swallowed, the pieces of herself she had lost trying to fit into a life that was never shaped with her in mind. Leaving wasn't just an end. It was a beginning. A small, trembling beginning. One that would eventually lead her to a community arts center, to a tiny apartment above a bakery, to mornings that smelled like warm bread instead of cold absence. And eventually it would lead her to Corin Hale. But for now, Celine stood in the middle of her past, watching the man she once married step into a future that had never included her, realizing, with a strange and gentle clarity, that the greatest love stories don't start with fireworks and sweeping gestures. They start with someone who sees you, truly sees you. And maybe, just maybe, love wasn't what she thought it was all those years ago. Maybe love was quieter, steadier, kinder, and maybe it was waiting for her still. How Corin entered her life. After the quiet collapse of her marriage, Celine didn't embark on a dramatic reinvention. There were no grand journeys across foreign countries, no fiery declarations of independence, no cinematic breakthroughs that healed her overnight. Her transformation happened the way real healing does, slowly, unevenly, quietly. Life, after Dorian, looked strangely ordinary. And yet, in that ordinariness, she found a kind of peace she hadn't realized she'd been starving for. She moved into a modest apartment above a small family-owned bakery. The walls were thin, a little scuffed in places, and the radiators clanged like old pots waking up. But the air smelled of yeast, sugar, and warmth every morning. Children laughed on the street below, and neighbors greeted each other with a familiarity that felt like community instead of scrutiny. She picked up a job teaching creative writing at a community arts center, a place where the floors creaked and the paint peeled, but the rooms buzzed with life and authenticity. Teenagers gathered there not because it was prestigious, but because it was safe, welcoming, theirs. And that was where she met Corin Hale. The first time Celine saw him, he was kneeling on the floor, tightening a loose bolt on a broken chair while 3 kids hovered nearby, arguing about which superhero was superior. Corin only half listened to them, smiling to himself while offering the occasional, "You might be right," or "consider the physics of that for a moment," like he was the unofficial referee of their chaos. She remembered thinking he didn't look like someone who belonged in a wealthy man's universe, and maybe that was part of what drew her towards him. He was the opposite of everything she had known with Dorian. Where Dorian was polished, Corin was worn in all the ways that made someone trustworthy. Where Dorian was consumed by ambition, Corin was present. Where Dorian acquired, Corin offered. He didn't seek attention. Attention simply found him. Children loved him. The staff adored him. He knew how to fix leaky faucets, how to make a teenager who'd had a bad day laugh, and how to turn Friday mornings into small celebrations by walking in with a box of pastries. "Everyone deserves to start the weekend with something sweet," he would say, shrugging as though kindness was a habit rather than a choice. She had been determined not to be. At first, she kept her distance, not out of disinterest, but out of caution. Her heart felt like something fragile wrapped in thin tissue paper, something she wasn't sure she could trust with anyone, let alone a man with a smile like Corin's. But Corin wasn't one to push or demand or force his way into a life. He simply existed in a way that made it easy to let him in, inch by inch, moment by moment. He noticed when her shoulders tensed after a long day. He noticed when she stayed late organizing the writing room. He noticed when she was quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that meant she was wrestling with something inside herself. And instead of questioning her or analyzing her, he simply showed up. Sometimes with a cup of coffee he thought she might like, sometimes with a joke so gentle it made her laugh before she could stop herself. Sometimes with silence, real silence, the kind that didn't ask anything of her. He stayed late with her on evenings when she couldn't get the projector to work. He walked her home once after a rainstorm, when her umbrella snapped backwards and she looked like she'd been personally attacked by the weather. "It's not pity," he had said gently when she tried to decline his help. "I just don't want you to get struck by lightning today." Celine laughed that night, really laughed, and the sound surprised her. She hadn't realized how long it had been since her laughter wasn't carefully measured or socially appropriate. How long it had been since she felt free to simply exist without monitoring herself. Little by little, she found herself waiting for his footsteps in the hallway, listening for the warm timbre of his voice drifting from another room, looking for him when she walked into the center each morning. And little by little, her heart began to thaw, not with quick, reckless speed, not with the dizzying thrill she once mistook for love, but with something gentler, something safer, something like standing in sunlight after years spent in the shadow of a cold, beautiful structure. But even as Celine began to trust him, She held back pieces of herself. Not because Corin ever gave her reason to fear, but because she didn't trust her own ability to choose correctly anymore. Corin sensed her walls. He respected them. He never tried to climb them or knock them down. He simply stood on the other side, steady and patient, waiting to see if she would ever open the gate. He didn't ask to be in her life. He simply made it better, and that was what frightened her most. Because Celine knew the danger wasn't in falling for him. The danger was in realizing that he might be the kind of man you fall in love with slowly, quietly, without noticing until your heart is already leaning toward him. The kind of man who changes everything not by sweeping you off your feet, but by helping you stand on your own again. Celine had expected the ceremony to feel like a reopening of old wounds. She expected to feel a piercing sting, a shadow of bitterness, a hollow ache, something, anything. Instead, she stood there with an unexpected calmness in her chest, like watching a finished chapter fade from memory. The vows drifted through the air, polished and predictable, spoken by two people who had built an image of love, if not the true thing itself. As soon as the officiant pronounced the bride and groom husband and wife, the guests erupted in applause. The kind of applause that felt rehearsed, synchronized, almost orchestrated. Champagne glasses chimed. Photographers jockeyed for position. Dorian kissed his new bride, with a smile that looked picture-perfect, but not particularly passionate. Celine clapped too, softly, politely. The way one claps at a performance they're grateful is ending soon. But Corin didn't clap. His hands remained at his sides. His attention wasn't on the couple at all. Celine followed his gaze. He was still watching the ring-bearer. The boy had abandoned the velvet cushion and joined a small cluster of children near the rose trellis. He was laughing now, carefree, joyful, untouched by the complexities that trailed behind adults. Something about the boy's smile tugged warmly at the heart. But Corin's expression wasn't warm. It was pained, softly pained, the way someone looks when staring at a memory that never quite healed. Celine tried to ignore the unsettled flutter building inside her chest. But it was impossible to ignore the way Corin's shoulders rose and fell, too quickly, too tensely, as though trying to hide a tremor of breath. She finally leaned slightly toward him. "Corin, are you okay?" Yeah, I'm—" His voice faltered just slightly. "It's nothing. Weddings, you know," but his tone betrayed him. He wasn't thinking about weddings. He wasn't thinking about the bride. He wasn't even thinking about Dorian. His eyes had drifted again, following the small boy darting between the roses. "Corin," Celine tried again, more gently this time. He shook his head, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Come on, let's get some air. I remember you hate crowds." It was true. He remembered everything, it seemed, even the little things she didn't expect anyone to tuck away, and perhaps that was why she didn't press him. She simply nodded, letting him lead her through the masses of chattering guests. They slipped away from the noise, past waiters balancing silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, past women with diamonds heavy enough to redefine posture, past conversations about stock movements and vacations and social standings, until finally they reached the quiet garden behind the estate. Here, the world felt softer, shaded beneath the wide canopy of an old maple tree. The breeze rustled the leaves, as if whispering secrets older than any mansion on the property. The sweetness of late-blooming flowers drifted through the air, a pleasant contrast to the stiff perfume of the main event. Corin exhaled slowly, placing one hand on the low stone wall bordering the garden. His shoulders relaxed, but his expression still held that lingering shadow. Celine watched him for a moment, really watched him. There were things she admired about him, his patience, his sincerity, his quiet steadiness. But today, something else revealed itself. A fragility hidden beneath all that strength. A vulnerability he rarely let the world see. She stepped closer. "Who did he remind you of?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Corin stilled, just for a beat, just long enough for Celine to know that she hadn't imagined the depth of his reaction. His jaw tightened with a tension that wasn't anger, just pain, old pain, deep pain, the kind that doesn't fade even with time. "Someone I used to know," he said softly. "How old?" she asked. Corin hesitated. Then, 5. Just like the ring-bearer. Celine felt something tighten gently inside her. Concern, but also a quiet ache of empathy. She took one step closer, her voice softer now. "Corin, what happened?" He didn't answer. Not at first. He looked away from her, toward the sprawling estate, toward the lake shimmering in the distance, toward anything that wasn't the question hovering between them. For a moment, the silence felt heavy enough to break. But Celine didn't fill it. She didn't rush him. She let him breathe. She let him find his words in his own time. And perhaps it was that patience, that stillness, that allowed him to finally speak. His voice was quiet, barely shaped. "There are stories I don't tell," he murmured. Celine nodded gently. "I understand." "But," Corin continued, his voice trembling on the edge of something vulnerable, "some stories don't stay buried forever." He didn't give her more. Not yet. Not here, in this moment carved out of someone else's celebration. His silence still held a weight that promised there was more, much more, hidden inside him. Celine didn't push further, because sometimes the heart needs time before it can trust its own voice. Instead, she simply placed her hand on his forearm, a small, almost hesitant touch. But Corin didn't pull away. His muscles relaxed under her fingertips, like her touch had steadied something in him he didn't know was shaking. She didn't know why this mattered so much, why she suddenly cared so intensely about a story he hadn't told yet. She cared, and that realization sat in her chest like a soft, budding truth. Family. Before we continue deeper into Corin's hidden truth, let me ask you, have you ever met someone whose silence spoke louder than their words? Tell me in the comments. Your engagement helps these stories find more hearts just like yours. And so, under the quiet shelter of an old maple tree, Celine felt something shift, not in the world, but within herself. She had come here to face her past. She hadn't expected to walk directly into a piece of someone else's, someone who mattered, someone who might matter even more than she knew. The garden behind the lakeshore estate was quiet enough to hear the soft rustle of leaves, the distant hum of champagne-fueled laughter, and the faint echo of the wedding music drifting from the reception tent. But between Celine and Corin there was a different kind of quiet. Heavier, closer, alive with an unspoken truth begging for breath. Corin stood with his hand braced on the stone wall, the sunlight filtering through the trees, painting faint gold across his face. His chest rose and fell with careful breaths, the kind people take when they're trying not to let their memories break them open. Celine waited. She didn't rush him. She didn't push. She had learned, painfully, that some stories demand gentleness, not interrogation. And Corin. He was not a man who carried light, simple memories. His silence had weight, layers, history. Finally he drew in a breath. "I wasn't always here," he said. Celine tilted her head, listening. "I grew up in a small town. Not much to do. Not many people. One of those places where everyone knows what you had for breakfast before you do." He huffed out a short laugh, but it wasn't humor. It was nostalgia and ache tangled together. "I had someone there once." Celine didn't ask who. She already sensed this wasn't a tale about a friend or a relative, not with that softness in his eyes. He looked down at his hands. The name fell from his lips like a quiet confession. And the moment he said it, Celine understood that this wasn't a wound he revisited often. This was a memory he guarded carefully, not out of shame, but out of reverence. "We grew up together," he said. "Same neighborhood, same school, same everything, really. She was sunshine, not the loud, scorching kind, the warm kind, the quiet kind, the light that slips through blinds in the morning and tells you the world is still good." Celine felt something gentle stir inside her, not jealousy, but empathy, a recognition of what it meant to remember someone who shaped your life long before it made sense. Corin continued, "I didn't really understand what she meant to me until we were older, until we realized the world outside our little town wasn't going to be kind or easy, but we had each other. And that felt like enough." He paused, swallowing. Then she got pregnant. Celine's breath caught. Quietly, discreetly. Corin's voice softened. "It wasn't mine." He said it not with bitterness, but with the acceptance of a truth he had lived long enough to no longer flinch from. She was involved with someone for a short time. Someone who wasn't ready to be a father. Someone whose family encouraged him to disappear rather than deal with the consequences. That kind of abandonment left a mark on everyone involved. "So she came to me," Corin said, "not to ask for anything, just because I was there, because I cared." His gaze drifted toward the lake, as if somewhere in the rippling water lay a reflection of a life he once knew intimately. "I helped her through the pregnancy. I took her to appointments, sat next to her when she cried, painted the crib she bought second-hand." He let out another breath. "I wasn't the father, but I loved them. Both of them." Celine felt her throat tighten. Corin's voice deepened, quiet and carrying years of weight. "When the boy was born, I felt something I can't explain. Something big. Something that felt like purpose." His lips barely curved in a nostalgic smile. He was so small, so perfect, so everything. Celine could picture it. The tenderness in Corin's hands, the softness in his eyes, the fierce protectiveness in his heart. "I thought maybe one day I'd become his stepfather," he admitted. "Not because it was expected, but because it felt right." His voice trembled. Barely, but enough. But her family hated the idea. They believed Arcadia deserved more money, more status, more security. They didn't think I could offer her the life she deserved. Celine's chest tightened in understanding. She had lived in a world where love and worth were weighed by bank accounts and last names. And one day, Corin continued. They decided for her. Celine's eyes lifted sharply. What do you mean? His jaw clenched. They moved away, packed everything, told her it was best for her and the baby. And he inhaled shakily. She didn't fight it. Celine felt a pang. Not judgment, not frustration, but sadness. Some people never learn to fight for themselves until it's too late. Some carry their own wounds into motherhood and believe surrendering is safer than choosing. Did she say goodbye? Celine whispered. Corin's silence answered for him. The ache in that silence was sharp, the kind of sharp that reshapes a person's heart. I lost them both, he murmured, not because I didn't love them, but because love wasn't enough to win against everything else. The wind moved through the leaves above them, the soft rustling like a sigh from the earth itself. Selene stepped closer, slowly, carefully, and placed her hand on his arm again. This time he leaned into the touch, however slightly. Corin, she said gently, you didn't fail them. His eyes flicked toward her, filled with a grief that had aged into quiet acceptance. But he didn't need to. The gratitude in his gaze was answer enough. The garden felt smaller now, not suffocating, but intimate, wrapped around them like a cocoon where truths could finally breathe. Celine had never imagined she would be the one hearing this story, but now that she knew, she felt something shift inside her. Something warm, something protective, something like a thread weaving their lives a little closer together. Because heartbreak recognizes heartbreak, and healing recognizes healing. And in this quiet moment beneath the old maple tree, Celine realized that she wasn't the only one who had lost quietly, gently, painfully. Corin had too, and maybe, just maybe, their hearts understood each other more than either of them realized. Family, let me ask you something. Do you believe people are brought into our lives to help us heal parts of ourselves we didn't know were hurting? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps this story reach more hearts who need its message. Corin exhaled, the weight of his confession settling into the space between them like a fragile, precious thing. He didn't apologize for telling her. He didn't retreat into himself. She stayed. She listened. She cared. And that was how the quietest connections often began. Not with fireworks, but with truth. Not with declarations, but with understanding. Not with romance, but with the simple grace of being human together. Celine realized then that some people enter our lives not as storms or miracles, but as gentle shifts in the wind, and everything changes quietly before we realize it. The quiet of the garden wrapped around them like a soft blanket, sheltering their shared silence. The distant laughter from the reception felt far away now, like a different world entirely. A world of polished smiles, flawless gowns, carefully arranged centerpieces. A world Celine once lived in but never belonged to. But here, beneath the shade of the maple tree, everything felt raw, honest, human. Corin's confession hung in the air like a delicate thread, fragile yet grounding. The kind of truth that changes the shape of a moment, not through drama or intensity, but through the vulnerability required to speak it. Celine looked at him, really looked at him, and what she saw wasn't weakness. She saw someone who had loved deeply enough to break, someone who had cared fiercely enough to let go, someone who had learned, painfully, that life doesn't always reward the heart that tries hardest. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze moved gently through the leaves above them, making the sunlight dance across the grass. A butterfly drifted by, settling briefly on a nearby flower before fluttering away again. Peace. That was the word that drifted through Celine's mind, not because the moment was easy, but because it was true. She took a slow breath and said softly, "You know, I thought coming here today would hurt. I thought watching Dorian get married would remind me of everything I wasn't, everything I failed at." Corin turned toward her, his eyes steady, open, giving her his full presence. "But it doesn't," she continued. "Not the way I expected." "What does it feel like?" Corin asked, his voice gentle. Celine thought for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It feels like watching a chapter close, one that needed to close, one that wasn't written for me anymore." Corin nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the doors we close ourselves are the ones that give us the most peace." Celine gave a faint smile. "And sometimes we stay in rooms too long because we don't believe we deserve to leave." Corin's expression softened with empathy. "Not the kind born of pity, but the kind born of understanding. You didn't stay because you were weak, Celine. You stayed because you hoped. There's courage in that too." She looked at him, gratitude stirring quietly inside her. "And what about you? What did your past teach you?" Corin leaned against the stone wall, gaze drifting toward the lake shimmering through the trees. When he spoke, his voice carried a gentle heaviness, the weight of a lesson learned the hard way. "That you can love people with everything you have," he said, "and still not be the right person for their journey." Celine's breath stilled. "That letting go," Corin continued, "doesn't always mean you stop caring. Sometimes it means you care enough to step back and let life lead them where you cannot." The words sank deep into Celine's heart, blooming like truth in fertile soil. "And," Corin added quietly, "that even when life takes people away, it might be making room for someone new." His eyes met hers. And something shifted, something unspoken, something warm, something that felt like the beginning of a door opening. Not a leap, not a declaration, just a gentle creak of possibility. Celine felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with the fragile recognition of something tender stirring to life. "Corin," she whispered. He didn't step closer. He didn't reach for her. Instead, he simply held her gaze, giving her space to feel what she needed to feel. "I'm not asking for anything," he said softly. "I don't want to rush you, or confuse you, or make you feel like you owe me anything." She swallowed, emotions tightening in her throat. "I just want you to know," he continued, "that you're not alone in learning how to heal. I'm still learning to—" Celine exhaled, the breath shaky but honest. Maybe healing isn't something we're meant to do alone." "Maybe not," Corin murmured. She looked down at their hands, not touching, but close enough that the warmth from his seemed to brush against her skin. And though neither of them moved, they both felt the pull. The quiet, gentle gravity between two people who were beginning to understand one another, not through words, but through wounds. Celine lifted her gaze again. "You know, I used to think love was supposed to be overwhelming, sweeping, grand, the kind that knocks you off your feet." "And now?" Corin asked, curious but not pressing. "Now," she smiled softly, "I think love is supposed to feel like this, quiet, steady, real." A moment passed, then another. Silence, but not the lonely kind, the kind filled with possibility. For the first time in years, Celine felt hope blooming inside her, not in bursts of excitement, but in the slow unfolding of something gentle and true. Family. Let me ask you from the heart. Do you believe love is sometimes meant to arrive in a quiet way? After life has taught us its hardest lessons, share your thoughts below. Your comments help these stories reach more souls who need warmth and understanding. Corin pushed away from the wall slowly, his expression softening even further. Celine, whatever path you choose, I just want you to be happy. Truly happy. And what if happiness looks different than I expected? She asked. Celine's heart fluttered, gentle as the breeze rustling the leaves overhead. Perhaps happiness wasn't a mansion filled with silence. Perhaps it wasn't luxury, or perfection, or status. Perhaps happiness was knowing someone saw her, really saw her, and stayed. By the time they left the garden and walked back toward the main reception area, the sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting a warmer hue over the estate. The air hummed with music and laughter, with the clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversations layered on top of one another like threads in a tapestry. But between Celine and Corin, there was a quieter thread, something fragile, something new, something neither of them dared name yet. As they approached the grand reception tent, the world of chandeliers and linen-draped tables came into view. Waiters glided between guests like rehearsed dancers, balancing trays of champagne flutes and carefully arranged appetizers. Soft music floated from a string quartet in the corner, soon to give way to livelier songs for dancing. Celine hesitated at the edge of the tent. This was the kind of room she used to move through with ease, smiling, nodding, greeting, performing. But now, standing at the threshold, she felt the phantom weight of old expectations pressing against her. She felt Corin's gaze on her before she looked up. "You don't have to go back in if you don't want to," he said quietly. "We can leave." His words settled over her like a warm blanket. Gentle, protective, honest. She considered it. She could walk away now. Close the door on this chapter entirely. Never look back at this estate, this evening, this portion of her history. But something in her resisted the idea of leaving in retreat. "No," she said softly. "I want to see this through, just maybe not all the way in the middle of the crowd." Corin nodded, respect in his eyes. "Then we stay on the edges, together, together." The words slid into her chest with surprising ease. They stepped into the tent, keeping close to the outer tables where the noise was softer and the expected level of interaction was lower. A waiter passed by, and Corin took 2 glasses of sparkling water instead of champagne. He handed one to her. "Thought you might prefer this. You remember I don't like champagne?" she asked, faintly amused. "You once made a face after a sip like it had personally offended your ancestors," he replied with a small smile. "Hard to forget." She laughed, genuinely, unexpectedly. The sound felt like a small rebellion against the stiffness of the room. As the room filled with movement and chatter, Celine found herself more aware of Corin's presence than anything else. The way he subtly shifted his body whenever someone passed too closely behind her. The way he angled his shoulders to give her a sense of privacy in a public space. The way his eyes occasionally checked her expression, as if silently asking, "Are you okay? Do you want to leave?" She hadn't realized how soothing it was to be with someone who noticed her needs without making them a spectacle. A group of guests nearby burst into laughter over some joke, drawing momentary attention. Celine's gaze drifted toward the head table where Dorian and his bride sat, surrounded by people who reflected their world. immaculate, composed, perfectly in place. Once upon a time, she would have been seated there, smiling for the camera, posing for the image, performing the role. Now, she stood at the quiet edge of the tent with a man who held no title, no billionaire status, no polished veneer, only kindness and sincerity. She didn't miss the old life. She realized with a slow, soft certainty. She didn't miss Dorian either. Perspective, she replied. How different this all looks from the outside. Do you regret coming? He asked. She thought about it for a moment. No, I think I needed to see it, to prove to myself that I don't belong there anymore, and that it's okay. Corin nodded, his eyes soft. You belong where you can breathe. She let those words sink in, then gave him a small, grateful smile. And what about you? Are you okay? He hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was still adjusting to the vulnerability of sharing it, seeing that boy earlier. He admitted, it knocked me a bit off balance, but talking to you helped. A lot. Celine felt a tenderness rise in her chest. I'm glad. A lively song began to play, inviting couples to the dance floor. People moved toward the center with varying levels of enthusiasm. Some eager, some reluctant, some simply following social obligation. Corin glanced at the dance floor, then back at her. We can sit this out, he offered. You don't like dancing? She teased. I like it fine, he said. I'm just not sure if you want to. She considered the question. Dancing at events like this used to feel like a performance. Every step measured, every smile strategic, every moment watched. The idea of stepping onto the dance floor now felt complicated. I think I'd rather stay here for now, she said. Then here we stay, he replied easily. No pressure, no persuasion, just acceptance. Someone bumped into her from behind as they passed, and Celine's balance wavered unexpectedly. Before she could fully register the movement, Corin's hand was at her waist, steady, warm, instinctive. His fingers pressed gently against the fabric of her dress, grounding her. For a second, the world around them blurred. The chatter faded. The music softened. There was only the solid warmth of his hand, the steady look in his eyes, the space between them shrinking into something intimate. Got you, he murmured. The words were simple, but the way he said them landed differently. She nodded, her voice caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. Thank you. He seemed to realize he was still touching her, and yet neither of them rushed to pull away. The moment stretched, delicate and unspoken. Then, slowly, his hand slipped back to his side, careful not to make the movement abrupt or dramatic. They turned their attention back to the room, but something had changed between them. The air felt charged, not with tension, but with awareness. A joke drifted from a nearby table, and Corin leaned closer to comment on it, his voice low, meant only for her. She laughed, and he smiled at the sound. Another song came on. A child at a distant table started dancing in wild, carefree circles, drawing chuckles from the adults around him. Bit by bit, the heaviness of earlier faded, replaced by something lighter. At one point, their hands brushed on the edge of the table, an accidental touch. Celine could have pulled away. So could Corin. Neither of them did. Their fingers lingered, resting near each other's, warm and natural, not grasping, not clinging, just present. Celine didn't look down, neither did he, but they both felt it. It wasn't bold. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply honest. A quiet acknowledgement of something growing between them, like two seeds pushing through the soil at the same time, reaching for light. Family. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand speeches. Sometimes it begins with a hand at your waist when you stumble, or fingers that don't pull away when they touch. If you're still here with me, listening to this gentle beginning, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment in the comment section to say, I believe in slow, quiet love. As the evening deepened, the music shifted to slower melodies. Couples swayed together under strings of hanging lights. The bride and groom had become the center of 100 moving parts, the focal point of a carefully orchestrated celebration. But for Celine, the center of the night wasn't at the head table or on the dance floor. It was here, at the edge of the room, beside a man who didn't ask for space in her life, but quietly made room for her heart to breathe. She knew she wasn't ready to leap into anything. She knew her heart still carried bruises, still flinched at shadows, still questioned its own judgment. She didn't feel broken. She just felt human. And as she stood with Corin, fingers still close enough to feel his warmth, she realized that the most beautiful romances don't always begin with sparks. With understanding. With two people standing side by side at the edge of a world they no longer belong to, quietly choosing each other in ways too subtle for anyone else to notice. As dusk settled over the estate, the sky turned a watercolor blend of gold and rose, with wisps of lavender clouds stretching across the horizon. The reception lights flickered to life, casting a soft glow that made everything look dreamlike. Too polished to be real, too delicate to be trusted. Celine slipped away from the tent for a moment of quiet, stepping out onto a balcony that overlooked the lake. The evening air felt cooler here, scented with pine and the faint sweetness of distant garden blooms. Fireflies had begun to emerge, tiny lanterns drifting in gentle patterns above the water. She leaned against the railing, her hands resting lightly on the cool metal. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt the weight of the day easing. She expected confusion. She expected old hurts to resurface. She expected to feel the sting of having once belonged to this world and being replaced in it. But the truth was gentler. She didn't ache for what she lost. She didn't crave what she once had. If anything, she felt gratitude. Gratitude that she could stand here, witness this moment, and not feel hollow. And though the wedding was not hers, the closure was. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the cool air, letting the wind brush past her as if carrying away the last thin traces of her past. Footsteps sounded behind her. She turned, expecting the warmth in Corin's eyes, the steady comfort of his presence. But it wasn't Corin. It was Dorian. Her ex-husband stood in the doorway of the balcony, framed by soft lights. He still wore his wedding tux, crisp, flawless, not a single crease out of place. His hair was combed with the same precision she remembered. His posture immaculate. Once, this image would have made her heart stutter with longing or pain. Now it simply made her feel like she was looking at an old photograph, familiar, but no longer hers to understand. "Celine," Dorian greeted, his voice measured as always. She straightened. "Dorian, you look, well," he said, as if the observation were a formal compliment. "Thank you," she replied. "You do too." Silence settled between them, not heavy but slightly awkward, like two people trying to remember how they once spoke to each other. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted. "Neither was I." He nodded slowly. Why did you decide to? Celine considered the question. Not the old answer she might have given, obligation, courtesy, politeness, but the truth. To close the chapter, she said, to see that part of my life end and be at peace with it. Dorian absorbed the words with a subtle shift in his expression. Not guilt, not regret, just understanding. And what did you see? He asked quietly. She met his gaze without fear, without hesitation, without any lingering thread pulling her back into the past. I saw two people who weren't meant to build a life together, she said. Not because we failed, but because we weren't the right people for each other. His lips parted slightly, as if her answer surprised him. I didn't expect you to say it like that. It's the truth. Dorian glanced at the lake, his jaw tightening for a moment in thought. I suppose it is. He stood beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. I wasn't the husband I should have been, he said suddenly. Celine blinked, not expecting the admission. He didn't look at her as he spoke. I convinced myself success was enough, that providing was the same as being present. I didn't realize what I was losing until after it was gone. Dorian. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he interrupted gently. You owed me nothing, and I gave you less than you deserved. Her heart softened, not with love, not with nostalgia, but with simple human compassion. You were doing the best you knew how, she said, and I was trying to fit into a world that wasn't built for me. We both made mistakes. He exhaled, a soft, almost relieved sound. Then his gaze drifted over her shoulder toward the doorway. Celine turned. Corinne stood there, not intruding, not demanding, just quietly watching, ensuring she wasn't alone if she didn't want to be. Dorian followed her gaze and let out a thoughtful hum. New relationship? He asked. A beat. Not yet, she added softly. She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because it felt true, even if unspoken. Dorian nodded, eyes flicking between them with a look that held a mixture of acceptance and something faintly wistful. He seems like someone who notices you, Dorian said. He does, she admitted. That's good. Dorian stepped back toward the doorway. I'm glad you came tonight, Celine. She nodded. So am I. He walked away, disappearing into the glowing reception. The moment he left, Corinne approached her slowly, carefully, as if giving her every chance to tell him she needed space. You okay? He asked. I'm fine, she said, and for the first time, she meant it completely. Corinne looked out over the lake, hands resting lightly on the railing. Fireworks in the distance began to crackle, sending bursts of warm light into the sky, reflections shimmering on the surface of the water. You know, he murmured, you handled that better than most people ever could. It wasn't a fight worth having, she said. Some stories end quietly, and some begin that way too. Her heart fluttered at the words, a subtle, soft flutter that didn't feel rushed or overwhelming, just real. Corinne, she whispered. He turned toward her fully now, the fireworks painting warm colors across his features. Celine, he said gently, I don't want to make assumptions. I don't want to push. But I need to be honest with you, she waited. Being with you today, standing beside you, it meant something to me. More than I expected, more than maybe it should right now. But it did. Celine's breath trembled. It meant something to me too. He stepped a little closer, not enough to overwhelm, just enough that the warmth of him brushed against the cool night air. "I care about you," Corin murmured, "more than I planned to." She swallowed. "I care about you too." A small smile tugged at his lips. Not his usual bright grin, but a soft, private one meant for moments that matter. "Good," he whispered. Fireworks bloomed across the sky, scattering color across the lake, and for the first time, Celine didn't look up at the light. She looked at him, and she felt the first quiet spark of something she didn't dare name yet. The fireworks eventually quieted, leaving only faint trails of smoke dissolving into the night sky. The music from inside the reception softened into a slow, romantic rhythm, the kind meant for swaying bodies and whispered promises. On the balcony, the world felt smaller, just two people, the lake, and the fading echo of color overhead. Celine's heartbeat had settled into a slower rhythm, but it hadn't quite returned to normal. It was still aware, very aware, of the man standing beside her, of the way his words lingered in the air between them, of the gentle warmth sitting in her chest where something tender had taken root. They didn't rush to fill the silence. They stood there, leaning against the railing, simply existing in the same space. It was a strange kind of comfort, one that didn't demand conversation, didn't insist on explanations. It allowed feeling to exist without immediately dissecting it. Eventually, Corin broke the quiet. "You know," he said, voice low and thoughtful, "I used to think love only counted if it hurt. If it broke you open, swept you away, turned your world upside down." Celine glanced at him, surprised. "The dramatic kind of love?" He nodded. "The kind you see in movies, the kind that feels like chaos and passion and constant motion. I thought if it wasn't like that, it wasn't real, or it wasn't enough." She smiled faintly. "Funny. I used to think if it didn't look perfect, it wasn't love. Now I think I was chasing an image," she said. "Not a person, not a connection, just an idea." He hummed quietly in agreement. "Maybe that's what we're taught. That love has to fit a certain mold to be valid." They fell into another brief silence, both staring out over the lake, calm, steady, reflecting the last pale traces of the fireworks. "You didn't answer me earlier," Celine said gently. "When I asked if you think life is making room for someone now." Corin's fingers brushed the railing, slow and thoughtful. "I didn't answer," he said, "because I didn't want to say something you weren't ready to hear." Her heart fluttered. "But if you're asking again," he took a breath. "Yeah. I think life might be making room for someone specific," she asked, her voice softer now. He turned his head, and for a moment their eyes locked. Nothing between them but quiet understanding, and the faint thrum of possibility. "Yes," he said. The words settled in the air like a small, beautiful truth. Celine swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Corin." He didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her. He didn't try to turn the moment into a confession drenched in pressure or urgency. He simply spoke with the calm of someone who had thought carefully before opening his heart. "I don't want to rush anything," he said. "And I don't want to make you feel like you owe me clarity or answers or feelings you're still figuring out." She listened, every word resting softly on her chest. "But I also don't want to pretend I don't feel what I feel," he continued. "Because today, standing next to you, watching you walk into a painful place and walk out of it with your head high, It made me realize something. What? She whispered. Despite the swelling emotion in her chest, she let out a small, shaky laugh. Love isn't very convenient, is it? No, he agreed softly. It usually shows up at the most complicated moments. He didn't say he loved her. Not yet. He didn't attach heavy labels to what was still tender, still forming. What he gave her was something lighter, but no less sincere. I care about you, Celine, he said. I care about the way you show up for those kids at the center. I care about how you laugh when you don't realize you're laughing. I care about the way you're learning to choose yourself now, even when it scares you. A warmth bloomed in her chest, full and gentle. And I care, he continued, that you don't ever mistake your past for a verdict against your future. Her breath stilled. He was giving her something she hadn't realized she needed. Permission. Permission to start again. Permission to feel again. Permission to believe that her story wasn't broken beyond repair. She looked at him, and the words came easier than she expected. The admission felt strange in her mouth. Not because it wasn't true, but because it had been so long since she'd allowed herself to say anything like it. His shoulders relaxed, the tension in his jaw softening. Yeah? He asked quietly. She nodded. You've been a safe place when I didn't know I needed one. Something flickered in his eyes at that. Something deep and quiet and full. Then maybe, he said, we can figure out the rest together. Slowly, carefully, honestly. She felt the corners of her lips lift, not into a wide grin, but into a soft, meaningful smile. I'd like that. No fireworks exploded overhead to mark the moment. No dramatic music swelled. No sweeping declarations were made. It was, in many ways, an ordinary moment. But for two people who had known love as something painful, complicated or conditional, the honesty of it felt extraordinary. They eventually left the balcony and walked back toward the front of the estate. The night air had grown cooler, and the music had shifted into its late evening rhythm, the part of a wedding where only the most determined guests stayed to dance and drink and stretch the celebration as far as it would go. Celine and Corin didn't linger. They moved through the estate like two people walking away from a chapter, not running, not hiding, just moving forward. As they approached the parking area, their hands brushed again. This time, it wasn't an accident. Celine looked down at their hands, close, almost touching, not quite. Then, with a quiet, deliberate choice, she slid her fingers into his. Corin's breath hitched. He didn't look at her right away, just tightened his fingers around hers like something precious had just been placed in his care. When he did glance at her, his expression softened into something she would remember long after this night ended. You sure? He asked softly. No, she answered honestly, but I'm willing. His smile widened just a little. I can work with willing. They reached the car, still hand in hand, still wrapped in the gentle awareness of a beginning that hadn't asked for permission to exist. It wasn't a grand confession. It wasn't a dramatic turning point. It was something quieter. But sometimes, the most important confessions are the ones that don't feel like confessions at all. They feel like honesty. And honesty, the kind that stands in the open without armor, is where love has the best chance to grow. The night air felt different when Celine and Corin walked away from the estate. Cooler, quieter, freer. The kind of air that made it easy to breathe in and even easier to let go. The parking area was dimly lit, marked only by soft lanterns and the steady hum of crickets chirping their nighttime chorus. The lavish glow of the reception tent remained behind them like a fading memory, a brilliant but distant world Celine no longer belonged to. She didn't look back. Instead, she focused on the feel of Corin's hand wrapped gently around hers. Their fingers were still intertwined, the warmth between them steady, real, unforced. It wasn't the grasp of two people leaping into something reckless, but of two people agreeing, without words, to walk forward at the same pace. At her pace. "Long day," Corin said softly as they approached the car. "Long chapter," Celine replied. He smiled. "And you closed it beautifully." She exhaled, a soft, relieved breath that seemed to lift years off her shoulders. "I didn't expect to leave feeling lighter." He opened the passenger door for her, the small, thoughtful gesture she'd always appreciated, the kind that didn't demand gratitude, didn't carry expectation, didn't pretend to be more than it was. Just kindness. "Sometimes," Corin said, "endings are what let us finally breathe." He paused, studying her with that attentive, gentle way he seemed to see right into the quiet corners of her heart. "This beginning, does it feel okay to you?" And that was the truth. It didn't feel overwhelming. It didn't feel rushed. It didn't feel like a leap she wasn't ready for. It felt like stepping onto a path she'd been approaching for a long time. Slowly, silently, without realizing she was heading toward it until she finally arrived. Once inside the car, the engine hummed to life. The drive back toward the city felt peaceful, the kind of peace that settles into the soul when something deep inside finally aligns. Streetlights blurred past in quiet streaks of gold. The hum of the tires on the road was steady, soothing. Celine leaned her head against the window, watching the trees pass by, their silhouettes swaying gently in the night breeze. She wasn't thinking about the wedding anymore, or the dress she had worn, or the vows she had witnessed, not even the man she had once married. Instead, she found herself thinking about small things, the way Corin had steadied her earlier, the softness in his eyes when he talked about Arcadia's son, the warmth she felt standing beside him, and most of all, how natural it had felt to take his hand. It surprised her how much that moment meant. Not because it was romantic, though it was. Not because it hinted at something more, though it did, but because it was hers. A choice she made freely. Not out of pressure, not out of fear, but out of quiet readiness. When they pulled into her neighborhood, the familiar smell of the bakery drifted through her open window. Warm bread, sugar, cinnamon. Home. Not the kind of home she once lived in, but the kind where the lights glowed warmly behind thin curtains, where people walked their dogs at night, where laughter spilled from open windows. Corin parked the car and turned off the engine, letting the silence settle between them again. "I'm glad you let me come with you today," he said. "I'm glad you were there." He looked down for a moment, his thumb brushing lightly against her hand, the last trace of their earlier connection. "If you ever need support like that again, just ask. I'll show up. Every time." Celine felt warmth bloom in her chest, a soft, steady warmth she trusted. Not always, Corin admitted quietly. Not for everyone. But for you? Yeah. Her breath hitched, softly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for him to notice. He didn't comment on it. He didn't turn the moment into something heavier or more dramatic. He simply held a space between them with quiet respect. "I don't want to assume anything about what this could become," he said gently, "and I don't want to rush whatever you're feeling. But I do want to be honest." "Honesty is good," she murmured. "I want something real," he said. "Something slow, something steady, something we build together, Not because we're lonely or hurting or afraid, but because it feels right. Celine held his gaze, her heart swelling with something she hadn't expected to find tonight. Hope. Not the brittle kind she used to hold on to, not the desperate kind, not even the dramatic kind. A quiet hope. The kind that felt like waking up one morning and realizing the pain didn't hurt as sharply. The kind that comes from choosing yourself long enough to finally be ready to choose someone else. Gently, carefully, honestly. I want something real too, she said, but slowly. His smile was soft and warm. Slow is perfect. They stepped out of the car together. Corin walked her to the entrance of her building, his hand brushing hers again. This time a bit more intentionally, but still respectful of her pace. At her door, he paused. "Good night, Celine. Good night, Corin." She turned to go inside, but hesitated, just for a moment, before glancing back at him. He was still standing there, waiting to make sure she was safe, the streetlight illuminating the warm sincerity in his expression. It struck her then. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, and that made it beautiful. A gentle smile curved his lips. "Get some rest, Celine," and for the first time in years, she fell asleep with a heart that didn't feel heavy, but open. Family. If this journey touched your heart, remind it that healing is real, and new love can bloom quietly. Like, share, and subscribe to Love Tales with Mr. Bennett. Your support helps these stories reach the souls who need them most.